Welcome everyone to the second episode of KSM and Above, the series where I will be documenting my journey of achieving KSM and seeing how far I can get after that. The first dungeon in today's video is a +5 Neltharis, and just like last episode, I won't be showing the entire dungeon to avoid the video being 3 hours long. So let's just skip right to the last trash pack before Magma Tusk. The most important thing to pay attention to in this area is a cast from the Thaumaturgus called Molten Core that will turn an ore elemental into a molten elemental if not interrupted. And those do a lot of damage to the entire group. It's not only interrupts that work though, you can also use stuns or knockbacks or that kind of stuff. The first boss of the dungeon is Magma Tusk, and he has a couple abilities that are important to pay attention to. The first of which is a frontal aimed at a random group member. The targeted player cannot avoid it, but everyone else can. Then you also need to avoid the charge, and as well as the waves that appear when the boss hits a wall. And then the tank also need to make sure that the boss isn't standing in lava puddles. The second boss of the dungeon is Chargath, whose main mechanic is Grounding Spear, which targets 3 random players who gets chained to the ground. And then the tank needs to drag the boss through these chains to break them and stun the boss. There's also a frontal everyone can avoid. Forts Master Gorak is the third boss of the dungeon.
Incoming.
And he also has a couple abilities that are important to pay attention to. Firstly, he'll hit his anvil, doing damage to the entire group. Afterwards, he'll throw a shield at a random party member.
Special coming.
Which will then bounce to another 2 party members.
Watch your step.
Make sure to stay spread out, since that leaves swirlies on the ground.
AoE incoming.
That you need to avoid. Gorak will also throw his hammer into the forge, which will send out swirlies to dodge. Lastly, Gorak will knock back the tank and jump to the location of where the tank landed and leave a big fire puddle. Warlord Sacha is the final boss of the dungeon, who also has a couple important abilities to pay attention to. Firstly, there's a frontal that everyone needs to avoid. There's also an ad that you can just pull on top of the boss and cleave down.
Step.
But the main mechanic is Magma Shield.
Shockwave.
Periodically, Sacha will gain a shield that will deal a lot of damage to the entire group. You need to break the shield as fast as possible. And you do that by using the cursed items lying around the room. I would definitely advise to pick up the items before the shield spawns, so you can break it faster. The second dungeon of today's video is a +7 Dragonflight Hollow. There are multiple of these war scourges in the area before the first boss.
Grapevine.
And it's important you interrupt their hideous cackle.
Run.
Because otherwise the entire group will be feared.
Interrupt.
The first boss of the dungeon is Hecklaw's Warband, which is a 3-target boss encounter.
2,
and
1.
All 3 have their own mechanics you need to deal with. Gashtooth will jump to a random group member and deal damage. Hecklaw will use Bladestorm, move out of that, and interrupt Trick Totem as often as possible
4, 3,
to minimize damage.
2, 1.
Breakvine.
Aside from that, they also have another mechanic that they didn't get to use in this run because they died too fast. But that is, they spawn a totem that DPS need to destroy as fast as possible, so the healer can dispel the tank, so
4,
the tank can
3, 2,
stop the
1.
charge aimed at a random group member. The second boss of the dungeon is Treemouth. He also has some important abilities to pay attention to. First off, there's a frontal called Wine Whip that's aimed at the tank. Everyone else needs to avoid it. Then Treemouth also will spawn some swirlies under a random player
4,
marked by
3,
a red arrow.
2, 1.
These swirlies also spawn ads that the tank will need to pick up and then cleave down with the boss.
Defensive.
Lastly, Treemouth will try and consume the entire group. You do want to avoid this, although it is important that one person does get consumed.
3,
Otherwise,
2,
Treemouth
1.
will gain a pretty sizable attack buff. And you cannot get consumed 2 times right after each other because you get a debuff. So I would recommend rotating between the tank and the melee DPS.
Shockwave.
4, 3, 2, 1.
Breakvine. Run.
The third boss of the dungeon is Gutshot, and he also has some important abilities to pay attention to. First off, there's Gutshot, which is an ability aimed at the tank
1.
that knocks back and deals moderate damage. Then Gutshot will also periodically call hyenas into the arena.
Target you.
In the beginning you can just group these up, but they will eventually fixate a random player.
Interrupt.
And this happens, try and bait them into the
4,
traps
3, 2.
that will be dropped under random players periodically throughout the fight. The final boss of the dungeon is the Kadriak Rathai, who also have some important abilities to pay attention to. The most important
Shockwave.
thing is to keep withering rot stacks to a minimum. Whenever you gain a stack of this debuff, you do less
4,
damage,
3,
Attack totem.
2,
and the only way of removing
Break
it
vine.
is with another one of Rathai's abilities, Decaying Strength, which consumes any stacks the group has. And for every stack consumed, Rathai gains a stacking
Attack totem.
damage buff. The ways you would get these stacks if you step into the rot cloud rotating around the
4,
room,
3,
or
2,
the totems
Shockwave.
get
1.
their casts
Break
off.
vine.
So, number one priority is defeating the totems as fast as possible. And that's where we end today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and then I'll see you in the next video.